Good morning, everybody. So, what we're doing today is we're going to explain the Persian Wars. This is a series of wars that happen over a few decades when the Persian emperors sitting in Iran and Iraq, in current day geography, have expanded their empire all the way westward to the Aegean Sea. And they've taken some islands that normally trade with Athens, and they're starting to make demands on Athens and Sparta that they be loyal to the Persian emperor. So, this is what happens. Around the year 540 BCE, before the Common Era, before the year zero, the Persian Empire got big enough to start competing with the Greeks for control over the Mediterranean Sea. Some islands near Greece had been taken over by the Persians under their emperor Darius. These islands gave over their land and their water. The Persians had a really interesting ceremony. When they wanted you to prove that you were going to be loyal to the emperor, they came to your city and they demanded a pot full of dirt and a pot full of water. And you might just give these up and think, okay, if you're going to basically leave me alone other than taking away these pots, that's fine by me. But in reality, the situation is these are symbols. You are promising that all of your land and all of the sea around you really belong to the emperor of Persia, and that he can do whatever he wants with them. So if you give over that pot of dirt and that pot of water, you're sending a big signal to the Persians that you'll be loyal to them and that you don't need to be invaded in order to learn how to serve the Persian emperor. These islands did this ceremony and they gave over their land and their water to the Persian emperor, and then started paying taxes to the Persians and started having to trade with only the people that the Persians wanted them to trade with. And that's a real problem for the city of Athens, because if you remember, Athens has to trade to survive. They don't have good farmland. They can't grow all the food that they need. They can't get all the resources that they need just by staying at home. They have to trade with people. And so these islands were great trading partners with Athens. Athens got supplies and cash from these islands. And all of a sudden, the Persian emperor is saying, no, you can't trade with Athens anymore. These islands don't want to stay in the Persian Empire, and the Athenians don't want them to stay in the Persian Empire because the Athenians want the cash and the goods. So they send a distress signal out to Athens, and Athens agrees to help them rebel against Emperor Darius. So, because Athens needed the trading partners, they said yes. However, the rebellions of these islands failed, and Emperor Darius wanted revenge. He sent messengers to Athens and to Sparta. The messengers never came back. They were the ones who were supposed to collect the pots of dirt and the pots of water, but the Athenians threw the messenger off a cliff, and the Persians were very angry at that. The Spartans took the messenger that Darius sent to them, and they kicked him down a well that was reserved for publicly executing horrible criminals. So the Persian emperor definitely was not cool with this, the death of both of his messengers. So he sent a fleet. Darius sent a fleet of 25,000 men on ships in order to conquer the city of Athens and to get revenge on Sparta as well. They landed 26 miles away from Athens, and they were going to march the rest of the way. The place that they landed was a beach in the Greek town of Marathon. Yes, you know the town of Marathon from the sporting event that takes its name from the town. The Athenians were led by a general named Miltiades. So Miltiades was the leader of the Greek forces. He only had about 10,000 Greek soldiers, most of them Athenians, to block the path of this 25,000 strong army of Persians. The Athenians needed more help. They wanted support. So they sent a messenger to the city of Sparta. And this messenger was named Phidippides. And Phidippides' job was to sprint all the way to Sparta from Athens, deliver the message that the Persians were coming and the Spartan army was needed now, and then sprint back to Miltiades to tell him whether it worked. Well, Phidippides sprinted all the way to Sparta, gave them the message, but the Spartans said, "Oh man, that's a real drag. We're so sorry we can't help out right now. You're going to have to face them by yourselves for at least a week, because we're in the middle of a big religious ceremony, and it would dishonor the gods for our army to march out in the middle of a religious ceremony. It's going to be a week. So, good luck till then." They figured the Athenians really stood no chance, that the Persians would probably just be able to take out the Athenians in the meantime, and then the Spartans would be able to take on a weakened Persian army. The Persians waited on the beach. They couldn't advance forward very easily, because even though they outnumbered the Greeks 2-1, they actually had very poor territory to try to get out of. The beach itself wasn't great for military maneuvers, and Miltiades had put himself and his men on top of a hill that overlooked the beach. So the Persians would have to march up the hill to try to take on Miltiades, and it wasn't going to be the easiest thing in the world. So Datis, the commander of the Persian invasion force of 25,000, made a smart decision. His decision was to take half of his army and put them back on their boats, leave about 12,000 men to be against Miltiades' 10,000 Greeks, take the other 13,000 men by boat closer to Athens, and Miltiades can't do anything about it, because if he turns around and starts marching back towards Athens, he leaves the hill, and the Persian army that's left behind, the 12,000, can take the top of the hill and then hit Miltiades from behind. So he's splitting his forces in half in front of Miltiades, sailing half of them towards Athens, so that Miltiades will either have to turn his back on the 12,000 that are left and get hit in the back, or he'll have to stay and try to crush an army that still outnumbers him at 12,000 to 10,000. So the Persians split in half, and just as the last of the forces were getting on board the boats, leaving 12,000 there, Miltiades decided now is the time to strike. So Miltiades ordered his army down off the hill and onto the beach to slam into the Persian 12,000 that were there on the beach, while the 13,000 were sailing away. It was a huge success for Miltiades. His soldiers were more heavily armored, they had more protection. It was a lot harder to kill any of them than it would be to kill the Persians in front of them with like wicker and bamboo armor and bows and arrows. Like, it was going to be not that hard. And it really wasn't. Miltiades went down off the hill, slammed into the 12,000 soldiers that were left of the Persian army, and just crushed them. I think the casualty rate for the Greeks under Miltiades was under 200. Less than 200 men died, and pretty much the entire 12,000 man army of the Persians that stayed on the beach were killed. Either killed in battle or drowned trying to swim towards their boats to get away. It was a huge victory for the Greeks, and it didn't take long either. So now Miltiades knew that he had another job to do. he had to get his men organized again and start marching them incredibly quickly towards Athens. But he also needed to get a message to Athens to tell them, don't surrender. If you see Datis's navy sail up, if you see the Persian emperor's forces sail up to you, and I'm not there yet, it's okay. Don't surrender to him. We will be there. We will fight. So they sent the same sprinter that they did before, this guy named Phidippides. Phidippides sprinted the 26 and a half miles from Marathon to Athens to deliver the message. He delivered the word, the single word, Nike, which is Greek for victory, and then he fell down dead. And that's why Marathon is named in the honor of the run that he did, which saved the city of Athens from surrendering to Datis and to Darius's forces. Anyway, Miltiades was able to quick march his troops all the way back to the city of Athens, and when Datis's fleet pulled up with 13,000 Persian soldiers and sailors, Miltiades was already there. And they were pounding their spears on the city walls and daring the Persians to get off their boats and come try it again. And Datis was too smart to do that. He knew it would be another bloodbath. He was stunned that Miltiades had beaten the force that he left behind and had managed to get back to Athens so quickly. So they sailed away, and the First Persian War was over. The Spartans, you remember the Spartans were asked for help. The Spartans never made it there. And so by the time they did get there a week and a half later, they were absolutely stunned at how hard the Athenians had fought, because they didn't think much of the Athenians. They thought that they were shopkeepers and pot makers, and they didn't think they'd be very good soldiers. So when the Spartan army got there and saw that a small force of Athenians had killed a large army of the Persians and driven off the other half of it, they were pretty impressed by the Athenian fighting. So, Phidippides went 26 miles to Athens to tell them the Battle of Marathon was a Greek victory. Then he died. The Persians sailed away because Miltiades and his army were waiting for them. 10 years later, though, the Emperor Darius had died, and his son Xerxes had taken control of the Persian Empire. Xerxes had a giant grudge against the Greeks because they'd been his dad's one failure, the one thing that his dad had tried and failed at. And Xerxes didn't want to be a failure. He wanted to make up for his dad's failure. So he sent an army of about 500,000 men, and he led them himself into Greece. Now, if you think of the geography of Greece, it's mostly islands, and the mainland of Greece is mostly mountain ranges. So it's going to be really tough to bring an army of 500,000 men into Greece and feed them, unless you march them on the waterfront. That way your navy can constantly set up food stations along the way. And that's what Xerxes had to do. The Greeks knew that he'd have to do this. And so they set themselves up to stop Xerxes' invading army in one super strategic spot. The Persians would have to come through this spot if they wanted to try to get to Athens to burn it down. And the Athenians and their allies, this time the Spartans actually got their act together and got an army together. So the Spartans are helping the Athenians, plus all the other city-states. Thebes, Corinth, Olympia, Delphi, they've all sent soldiers to this big Greek army to stop Xerxes' 500,000 man invading force. So Xerxes marched in with 500,000. He was supplying them on the waterfront with his navy. They had to go through a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. Thermopylae actually means hot gates in Greek. So this is a hot water, freshwater spring bubbling up in a mountain pass that is like the gateway to Greece. So the Athenians and the Spartans and all the other Greeks set themselves up in this narrow mountain pass, probably only about 200 men wide. If you've got an invading army of 500,000 men, and you've got to march them through a spot where you can only fit a couple hundred at a time, and that's the only choice that you have, that's a good spot for somebody to ambush you. Because you can only use 200 soldiers at a time. It doesn't matter how big your army is. You're limited to how many men can fight at any one time. And if the other army has better quality soldiers and fewer of them, they can set themselves up in that 200 and they can do the job. So, 7,000 Greeks waited to try to stop an army of 500,000. There were 300 Spartans, and they were led by their king, and I've heard it pronounced two ways, Leonidas or Leonidas. I tend to go with Leonidas. So Leonidas was one of the two Spartan kings, the one who had been sent to go help this Greek force. And he set himself up and his 300 Spartans, and they also had a couple of more like 1,000 slaves, helots, who were there with them to help fight side by side with the Spartan citizens. So when we say the 300, it's not like it was only 300. It was more like 1,300, but 300 of them were Spartan citizens, soldiers. So they were there to stop the Persian army. When the Greeks found out exactly how many Persians there were and how big the forces were, the Spartans got all cocky. And the Spartans said to the rest of the Greeks, you guys go home. We got this. We'll stop them for as long as we can. We will die. All of us will die. Every single one of us will die. But we'll stop these Persians for days and days and days right here in this mountain pass. Rather than you guys stay and die, why don't you go home and grab your wives, grab your kids, grab your stuff, because when the Persians do get through, they're going to burn your cities. So go home, get your families, and then keep going in the opposite direction from this battlefield, because the Persians are coming and they're going to take you down. So we'll stay here and fight to the death. We got this. The Spartans stayed to fight while the rest of the Greeks retreated. None of the Spartans survived. It's said that one of the great quotes of the Spartan leader, one of his men came up to him and said, "Your Majesty, it looks like the Persians have enough arrows so that their archers could just completely blot out the sun with arrows." And Leonidas, the king of the Spartans, came back with, "Yeah, don't worry about it. We'll just fight in the shade then." Yeah. So, that kind of bravery, that cocky bravery that the Spartans could pull off. Yeah, if they blot out the sun with arrows, we'll just fight in the shade. Delightful, huh? Anyway, no Spartans survived. Athens was then burned to the ground. The Athenians had managed to get their families and get their valuables and leave the city. But when the Persians got there, they just destroyed the city. An Athenian leader, Themistocles, lined up his navy in a narrow little pass in between an island and the mainland. Just like Thermopylae was a narrow little mountain pass, the Greek navy under the Athenians, under Themistocles, is going to line itself up in this narrow little pass between an island and the mainland called Salamis. And the smart part of it was, well, you don't expect Xerxes to fall for the same trick twice, to think that he's going to have to go through this narrow little pass and waste so many more men right? Like the Battle of Thermopylae, he lost thousands and thousands and thousands of men trying to get through these 300 Spartans and their 1,000 slaves. He doesn't want to have to do that again. So he doesn't send his navy into this narrow little pass. Themistocles, though, decides to get super smart. Themistocles sends a spy to pretend to be a traitor. And this traitor goes to the Persian king and says, "Oh, great Xerxes, I'm switching sides for you because there's no way the Athenians can win. Here's the information that I can give you, but you have to act on it right away. The Athenians, their navy is arguing with itself, like the ship captains can't come up with a plan. They're in that narrow little pass, and they're retreating because they can't come up with a plan, and your fleet is so big. So the only way you can catch them and end this war right away is to go into that pass now, catch them, and crush them while they're still arguing with each other." Well, Xerxes falls for it. He sends his fleet right into the narrow the narrow water pass, the narrow strait in between Salamis, the island, and the mainland. But the Athenians are organized, and they are waiting for him, and they crush his navy. After Xerxes' navy is just torn apart, and his army is exhausted from the Battle of Thermopylae and then from burning Athens, he doesn't want to be in Greece anymore. It's just horrible for him. And so he grabs his navy, what's left of it, he grabs his army, what's left of it, and he leaves. And the Athenians and the Spartans have won. So that's the last of the Persian Wars. He quits, and he goes home. Xerxes is gone. Some of the Greeks decided to form an alliance called the Delian League. The Delian League was to be navy-based, and so Athens was going to be the leader of the Delian League because they had the best navy. And it was all going to be about keeping an eye on Xerxes, keeping an eye on the Persians. Okay? And if the Persians started to rumble towards Greece again, the Delian League would pull it together and fight. To be in the Delian League and to get defended by the Delian League, you had to pay dues every year to the Delian League. And they kept the dues on the island of Delos. And that's why it's the Delian League, because the treasury building was on the island of Delos. And Delos was uninhabited. Nobody lived there except for the guards who were keeping track of the money. Athens decided, as the head of the Delian League, to make some withdrawals from the bank that nobody else knew about and nobody else approved of. And these withdrawals were to help the city of Athens rebuild itself, because remember, the Persians burned it down. So the Athenians take money from the Delian League, and they use it to enlarge their power and rebuild their city bigger and much more beautiful than it ever had been before. But not every member of the Delian League is going to be thrilled with the way that the Athenians misuse the money that's entrusted to them. So that ends Chapter 5, Section 2. We're going to talk about Chapter 5, Section 3 the next time we're together. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for learning about the Persian Wars. And thank you for tolerating me. Have a good one.